This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So the first speaker is Maurizio Isabella, who is a senior lecturer in history at Queen Mary University of London, and of course he's very well known these days for his wonderful book Risorgimento in Exile, a very elegant book in some ways. I was thinking in some ways that it's somehow connected. It's almost like it's both this and Silvana's book are kind of studies in history of ideas. At least that's how I look at it. It's kind of interesting to have these two together on the same platform. So Maurizio is going to talk about virtue in the Risorgimento. And then, I'll just do the rest. Then we have Massimo Riva, who is a very distinguished professor from Brown University, who's written many works on Italian literature. But what's interesting here, I think, in reference to what he's going to do this evening or this afternoon, is that he's also very much involved in using humanities research in the context of emerging technologies. So he's got a series of award-winning projects, online projects, the Cameron Webb Pico project and this Garibaldi and Risorgimento project, which is in some ways the most appropriate one these days. He will be showing a short video clip, which is part of an installation currently at Mambo, the Museum of Modern Art of Bologna, which is connected in some ways to the 150th anniversary of the unification of Italy. And then Silvana, I think, was going to be reflecting upon what she learned from this conference. So I hand the floor over to you three, and Maurizio will start.
Okay, thank you very much. I decided to discuss very briefly the idea of virtue in the Risorgimento for the reason that basically virtue as a sort of political concept is absolutely vital. It was considered to be vital as a foundation of the Risorgimento itself, as a national project. So there is no Risorgimento without virtue. And this idea, of course, belongs to a much older intellectual tradition, the Republican tradition, that linked inextricably the idea of the patria to the idea of political virtue. There cannot be patria without the active participation of the citizens in its political life. And so this idea is intimately connected to Silvana's work and research, because the problem that the Italian patriots have with the vices is precisely linked to this. You know, if the Italians do not get over their vices, they cannot be virtuous, hence they cannot become citizens. As you say clearly in your book, you know, this concern with Italian vices is a concern related to the problem of turning Italians into citizens. And that's why you need virtue. And as Silvana reminded us yesterday in her brilliant talk, she made a reference to a Democrat from the Triennio Rivoluzionario. She mentioned Boccalossi, who was concerned with the education of the people, of the masses. And the aim of the education of the masses was, in that period for the Democrats, that of making them, sort of enabling them to be fully fledged citizens participating in the political life of the Republic, hence to be virtuous. They had to be trained to become virtuous, but at the same time they could not be virtuous unless they were free. So this was the position of the Democrats in a way. So what I'm going to look in the next 10 or 15 days is how this political position... Yes. No, I'm not an Italian MP. So sorry. What I want to see is how the Republican project of the Revolutionary Triennium that failed was rescued after the Napoleonic period. Clearly, this sort of ambition to create a virtuous republic failed, not least because of the sort of obvious hostility of the masses against the republican democratic institutions. But the awareness that virtue is needed remained a central concern for the patriots, the Risorgimento patriots, also after 1815. So what I'm going to do is to look at how this question is readdressed after the Napoleonic period, but I will focus in particular on the sort of liberal conservative spectrum of the political debate, because, as I hope I will demonstrate, is the one that leads to the position on the issue of virtue of the ruling class that actually made Italy in 1860. That's why I want to reconstruct an intellectual genealogy that is to the sort of center right of the political spectrum of the Risorgimento. And sort of an important tool that Italian liberals after 1815 decide to adopt to deal with this question is a tool that is common to all the post-revolutionary liberals in Europe. It's the decision to rediscover history and the national past. So how can virtue be recovered in Italy? Since it failed between 1796 and 1795, you need to look at the past political and institutional life of Italy that provided plenty of sort of successful examples of patriotism and active citizens that lasted for centuries. So this becomes an important source of reflection. 1796-99 failed because these Democrats wanted to import, foreign ideas, and virtue could not succeed in Italy. It could perhaps succeed now if we look back at our national past. And this can be done in very many different ways. It can be done in a sort of reactionary, republican way that is anti-liberal, anti-modern as well. We must not forget this. And this is the case of Carlo Botta, perhaps one of the most famous and widely read historian of the Risorgimento, whose history of Italy really provides a clear example of this solution to the problem of reinstating virtue in Italy. How do we do it? Well, we basically have to go back to the institution that existed in Italy before the French Revolution. They were successful, the people were loyal and attached to the institutions, whether in republics or monarchies, because they made sense to them, because they had been the result of centuries of history. So Botta is a Republican, but he is a conservative, anti-liberal, anti-modern Republican who wants to go back to the past history of Italy. He in fact takes Machiavelli as a model, an intellectual model that could be used in contemporary Italy with the adoption of the Tribunato del Popolo to create stable communities in the 19th century. Botta thought that the Democrats were the utopisti, that parliamentary representation could not work, and it would not work in Italy because of the character of the Italians. These were unstable, flimsy, weak, emotional, irrational assemblies that were imported into Italy from France. They could never work. So his model is the model of the ancient aristocratic republics. His idea is that of a conservative virtue that gives political participation only to the aristocrats or to the people, only in a very indirect way through this institution of the Tribunato del Popolo. There is, however, another way of dealing with the Italian past, with this republican tradition that is rooted into the Middle Ages. And it is the model that is taken after 1815 by Ugo Foscolo, or by that generation of patriots who are directly or indirectly, in fact, inspired by the work of Sismondi. And this model of republicanism is, of course, not radical in any way, but it's certainly not anti-modern. In fact, it is also liberal and modern. Why? Let me just elaborate very briefly on this. So, virtue existed in the Italian medieval republic, where there was political participation by the whole society, but these societies, the ones that Sismondi favors and praises, are not the early democratic institutional sort of examples of the early Middle Ages, are the more mature ones in which there is participation, but not election. The people can participate, but they cannot be elected to the institutions of the commune. In fact, Sismondi is very critical of democracy. This is also a model of virtue that is modern, because Sismondi and his Italian admirers drew a parallel between medieval Italy and modern Britain. There is a model of virtue and patriotism. It's a model of political stability and economic development. In fact, for Sismondi and most of the Italian liberals, there's no tension between political virtue and luxury and commerce. And this is crucial because while the Rousseauian Democrats, the Democrats of the Triennio Rivoluzionario, one excluded the other, according to Rousseau's lesson, a true Republican had to reject a sort of luxury and the engagement in commerce to be a true patriot and to be truly virtuous. This idea is rejected by Risorgimento liberals because of the influence of Sismondi, but also because of the influence of the Italian tradition of public economy. I will not elaborate on this. So there is a model that combines commerce, economic growth, and virtue. The two things can actually stay together. This is the dominant idea among Risorgimento liberals. Now, this sort of, it is also a liberal model because it combines Republican virtue with constitutionalism, parliamentary representation, protection of individual rights. However, this Republican liberal sort of idea of virtue is one that will not survive until the end of the Risorgimento, I would like to argue. It is certainly one that is partly adopted and taken over by, for instance, the Tuscan liberals, like Gino Capponi, because the Tuscans celebrate their constitutional model based on the commune as the foundation of the polity by using the language of Sismondi and Machiavelli. It's the direct participation of citizens in the commune, the Tuscans say, but it is of course the direct participation only of the landowners, not of the masses who are excluded. Right. However, this model of liberal conservative republicanism is challenged quite systematically and profoundly after 1848 by the Piedmontese liberals and moderates. What happens after 1848? 1848 is a crucial turning point in the redefinition of virtue among the liberals. To begin with, for two reasons: because there were revolutions and the Democrats had been a threat and had been perceived as a threat by the moderates. And so Republican virtue had these radical overtones that had become dangerous. That's the first reason why Republican virtue is challenged by Cavour, by Balbo, by Mamiani, by Gioberti, by Carutti. All of these moderates dismiss it. But they also dismiss it because 1848 is a turning point in the institutional life of the peninsula because of the introduction of the Statuto Albertino in Piedmont. And this changes the political thought of liberalism. So these moderates criticize Sismondi, Botta, Foscolo, all of these people because they sort of criticize the medieval republics in the context of a contrast between ancient and modern liberty. They do what Constant had done at the beginning of the century, contrasting sort of the ancient republics of Greece or Rome and modern commercial states. They do the same, but they say the Middle Ages belong to the past. This is a kind of ancient or sort of hybrid idea of freedom and virtue. It does not apply to modernity. Now we have representative institutions, we have a parliament. Direct participation doesn't make sense anymore. Does this mean that the idea of virtue has to be thrown into the bin? No, we still need virtue. Virtue is vital for the survival of any political community, but it is a new idea of virtue. It is an idea of virtue that is detached from the Republican tradition. For instance, Balbo criticizes Montesquieu's classic distinction between virtue as something that existed in small ancient republics and honor as a crucial virtue of the monarchies. And Balbo and the moderates and Cavour say, no, virtue, there's no difference between virtue and honor, and virtue can exist also in modern monarchies, they say. But what is virtue then today, after 1848? It's something new. It is a love for the institutions, even if there is no direct participation, as there was according to the Republican tradition. It requires a new set of strategies and qualities attached to it. To begin with, it requires the national education of the elites. This is a crucial concept for the moderates. To create a virtuous community, you need to have a national education. But crucially, as Balbo said already in the 1840s, before the 1848 revolution, this national education is something that should only touch the elites of the country. Il volgo should be left out. For the volgo, there is only one virtue that is required. That virtue is morality, and that virtue is Christian morality. There's no longer any distinction for the moderates between Christian morality and political virtue. But certainly, for the masses, for the volgo, there's no need for political virtue, there's only need for Christian morality and obedience. This is what is required by them. I now, I think, come to my conclusions. So, why have I tried to sort of sketch this sort of intellectual genealogy? Because although there's a difference between Sismondi and Botta and Foscolo and Balbo, which I hope I've sort of explained, there are also some commonalities that I want to highlight. There is, first of all, an anti-revolutionary sort of strand in this ideology that I've sketched. These people react against the French Revolution. But also, Botta and Balbo and the admirers of Sismondi are profoundly anti-democratic thinkers. In what sense? They're all very critical of democracy. Their republicanism or their liberalism after 1848 is founded on a direct critique of democracy. And this is elaborated in a sophisticated way, in particular after 1848, according to the ideological tools provided by Guizot, Chateaubriand, and Tocqueville. For Italian moderate liberals, democracy is a totalitarian sort of political system that would lead naturally to tyranny or the oligarchy of a few sort of wealthy people, or it would lead to demagoguery and to the disintegration of society and anarchy. This is what they think of democracy. And of course, I'm not trying to argue that they are the only ones in Europe. This is quite a common sort of interpretation of what democracy is. And in fact, they look at what is happening in Europe and they have their ideas confirmed. Look at what happened in France. They had democracy in 1848, now they have tyranny. They have Napoleon III. Look at what happened to Britain. They have freedom because Britain never got rid of its aristocracy, of its elite, and there's no freedom without a social buffer between the masses and the monarchy. And that's what we learn from Britain. Britain avoided the revolution, and democracy, it is still free. And finally, what sort of a common element of all of these people that I've mentioned is their elitism. To be virtuous is something that is primarily something that is about creating a virtuous minority, a virtuous elite. That's why most of them are obsessed with the British, the English ruling classes that are taken as a model of virtue and dedication to the patria. Why does this matter? Because this is an idea these are the ideas of the elites who built the state between 1859 and 1860. It's the idea of creating a nation without political, or with limited political participation and with limited political education and morality and obedience for the masses. And in fact, whether this model can be successful or was successful to build a new political community, I leave it to you to judge. Thank you.
Yes, give me a second to wake up my computer. I could begin my contribution to the round table saying 150 years later, we move from a historical perspective to perhaps one that could say is more related to contemporary art, therefore to the way that contemporary intellectual artists, perhaps writers, are dealing with the past and our fading memory of it, including ideas of vices and virtues, and of course our way of being modern or anti-modern. So this is just a short premise. Now, if my computer wakes up, I'll be able to continue, otherwise I'll have to improvise, which is something that always happens in this situation. Well, let me start. Some weeks ago, I was invited by an artist friend of mine to play a small part in a project of hers, an installation at the Mambo, the Museum of Modern Art in Bologna. For the next month or so, visitors to the Mambo can see this installation by Emilia Mili Romano, a Sicilian artist who teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts and has been living in Bologna since the early 1980s. Do we have any technical assistance here? I don't understand why the computer is
automatically.
Oh, perhaps maybe it's my computer. I know that's what's frightening. You know, since I've been introduced as this wizard, it always happens. It's very funny, I mean, because it was up and running. The cable is there. Well, anyway, let me. I don't want to say. No, it is plugged in. Oh no, it's not. But it's not that. Definitely not. Well, don't worry about it. Okay, I'll start it again. Sorry. All right. You know what? I can. Why this always happens, I have no idea.
So it's not really...
It's dead.
It's dead?
Yes, no, I can if I can eject this DVD and I want to show the clip. That
Is the electricity connected? Or?
No.
Do you have a lead?
No, because I don't have a converter. I left it in my hotel room. But it doesn't matter. I mean, it's if I can. Right. Needed some. You know, computers are like persons. They like to attract attention and to create anxiety, particularly in their owners, so they can control us. You know. Let's see. All right. Let me. So, Emilia Romano. I was at Emilia Romano, a Sicilian artist who teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts and has been living in Bologna since the early 1980s. Conceived specifically for the gallery houses in Mambo's permanent collection, the work, entitled Italia, consists of a video accompanied by the staging of an action performance. And in a sense, my contribution dovetails very nicely with what Sharon Hecker was saying just now, just before, in the session before, because this installation has taken the place of Luciano Fabro's, temporarily, Luciano Fabro's work in the gallery. Taking as its starting point a quotation from Giacomo Leopardi's Discorso sopra lo stato presente dei costumi degli italiani, enter the password. The video installation brings to an ideal conclusion the series of initiatives promoted by the Bologna Museum in celebration of the 150th anniversary of Italy's unification. And now, in a second, I'll show you the 3-minute video. In this video work, made at the beginning of 2011, Emilio Romano proposes a personal exploration of the story of the Italian Republic, in which autobiographical memories are interwoven with emblematic events in the country's contemporary history. Since Mili and I belonged to the same generation, and full disclosure, we were also classmates in a Sicilian liceo back in the late 60s, I could say that I share at least some of these visual memories flashing in the background like flickering TV ghosts. And perhaps, if we can start now the video, I'll tell you what, I'll start this instead, and make sense of it in a second. This is a clip that I was planning to play later, but I'll play it now since, for the sake of time. This is actually a video about the installation, okay? So it's not the video that I'll hope to show you later, maybe, but it's a video about the installation. So we were back at the visual memories flashing in the background like flickering TV ghosts, and perhaps these memories are also shared by many other visitors to the Mambo's permanent collection, those in our age group at least. In this sense, to some extent, they are not private but public or collective memories. As the press release of the, can you see? The press release of the museum explains, the artist interprets the difficult process of planning and maintaining the unity of Italy by showing, quote, an allegorical movement of hands playing a game that incessantly rearranges its different geographical regions. So you have a map of Italy as a puzzle game, and let's see in a moment a clip of it. Since the video is set on a loop, the project of assembling Italy is shown as a sort of recursive deconstruction. Italy as a puzzle that it is impossible to complete, like the wood that is impossible to fit. It seems indeed an appropriate close to the 150-year celebration. This is Emilio Romano, by the way, in the background, reading from the Party. It's part of the action play that I'll talk about in a moment. Italian disunity as both a puzzling historical achievement and an endlessly open construction field, un cantiere perennemente aperto, with an ironic twist. The more hands in the end try to collaborate in order to get Italy right and put it back together, the more they seem to mess things up irreparably. As an allegory of impermanence, you see the video there where it is located in the museum. Maybe you can see. As an allegory of impermanence, Italia also seems like an appropriate installation for its specific setting, temporarily housed in a permanent collection of contemporary Italian art. Fittingly, the location of Italia in the museum's galleries is not fixed, but changes every week, so that over time it is positioned at different points on the viewer's route. New visitors will have to discover it or run into it by chance. Returning visitors will have to look for and find it again in a different place. Thus explains the artist, and I quote, Italia will momentarily construct a time and space within the museum that are different from the usual time and space of exhibitions and the art system, suggesting a new opening towards other ideas and digressions, end quote. An alternative utopian Italy, one might also suggest, that can neither be reduced to its colorful parts, nor composed into a harmonic whole, a description that can also apply to a paradoxical dystopia or to a frustrating and somewhat neurotic game. The screening of the video is accompanied by a performance, which is also a sort of interaction with the screen images. At 3:30 p.m. every day until December 18th and later, in fact it's been postponed to January, the end of the exhibit, the artist, seated on a chair that belonged to her grandparents, reads a passage from a work of Italian literature of her choice, and when she's done, sets the book under or next to her chair. As the books pile up around her, the quotes from the literary corpus thus slowly assembled a fragmentary canon of modern Italian literature from Leopardi forward to Calvino, Pasolini, Sciascia, Celati, Tabucchi, Simona Vinci, and many other contemporaries, enter into a dialogue with the visual puzzle. Oh, I should have perhaps played that later, but that's how I was involved in this in a moment. Suggesting that our canonic literary Italy is also an impossible or impermanent montage made of public literary statements and private literary memories, piled up side by side or mixed confusedly together. Now and then, the artist is joined in her performance by friends who are invited to bring along a book with a quote that they have chosen, a literary memory or fragment. They take the place of the author in her grandparents' chair and read for a few minutes or an hour, according to one's stamina and schedule. I was also invited, and in case you're curious, I chose to bring along and leave behind me, next to the grandparents' chair, a collage of fragmentary quotes from Carlo Emilio Gadda's marvelously ironic Le Meraviglie d'Italia. I'm very fond in particular of his descriptions of Milan, this most Italian allegory of modernity, as a city born of the wedding between uggia and cattivo gusto, which one could translate as boredom, or better, tedium, or glumness, and bad taste. Of course, we're talking about Milan of the 1930s or the 50s, not that of the 80s, 90s, etc. My own grandparents came from the Padania of that era, but from Bergamo. The first quote selected by the artist, as already mentioned, is a passage from Leopardi's Discorso sopra lo stato presente dei costumi degli italiani, one of the most quoted of works when discussing the roots of the unfinished project which is modern Italy, our unfathomable national character or identity, and also in relation to the open catalogue of Italian private virtues and public vices. It is the passage in which Leopardi laments how ambition, once upon a time a desire for glory, capable of transcending the present and achieving great things, is now reduced to a caricature of itself, a quote, confined within the smallness of modern ideas and passions, to its narrowest and lowest or basest meaning by calculating reason, Leopardi calls it geometric, and the political state of society, unquote. I have written on Leopardi's lament about the decadence of modernity in my 2001 book, Melanconie del Moderno. The title says it all, in which, following Leopardi's lead, I see melancholy as both a private vice and a public mask, the other face of the corrupting cynicism also lamented by Leopardi as a trait shared by both the Italian elite, the most cynical among all the national elites, and the Italian populace, the most cynical of all populists. And it's interesting that Peter Sloterdijk, in his critique of cynical reason in the early 80s, defines modern cynics as borderline melancholics. In my reading, Leopardi's critique of nationality and his radical discontent of civilization, the process of modernization, make of him, as a philosopher and as a poet, an anti-modern, albeit a prophetic one. Nobody, I think, can doubt that the current political state of Italian society, perhaps not only Italian, can be seen in all its apparent chaos as the triumph of cynicism, the triumph of a calculating or geometric reason, the financial semiotization of the world, as one Bolognese intellectual or anti-intellectual recently called it, quoting Bifo, Franco Berardi. The abstract rationality of financial markets, which exploits the emotional needs and the biopolitical rights of the global masses. However, the anti-modern strand that informs much of our modern literary and artistic tradition is hardly counterbalanced by the extreme modernism of our domestic avant-garde. as a radical antidote to a melancholic nostalgia for our glorious past, futurism, at least in its late manifestations, Marinetti, Accademico d'Italia, 1929, can be seen as another kind of national cynicism or transformism. In our postmodern age, the dichotomy between past and present seems to be mercifully resolved. Or is it? Coming to my conclusions, I'd like to mention a book that I was reading on the plane flying from Bologna to London the other day, Italia Reloaded, Ripartire con la Cultura, by Christian Caliando and Pierluigi Sacco. In short, Caliando and Sacco argue that Italy's dilapidated artistic patrimony, our national cultural DNA, our virtual cities of arts, our literary festivals and exhibit frenzy, have all become a tomb in which our past and our identity is not preserved but buried, arising from time to time to haunt us as a return of the repressed. The first chapter of Italia Reloaded is eloquently entitled Zombie Culturali, l'Italia dei Morti Viventi, Cultural Zombies, Italy of the Living Dead. According to Caliando and Sacco, for about 30 years now, since the early 1980s, we have been living in a collective state of cultural amnesia and in a sort of creative paralysis that cannot be reduced to an absence of economic growth. Our national debt is first and foremost a debt to ourselves, to our past as well as our future, and it is a cultural as much as an economic debt. The only antidote to this situation is a concrete reloading of our past. That is, I quote, for artists and writers to reactivate nostalgia, a proactive nostalgia indeed. I quote, able to use constructively and productively the past and our cultural heritage, abandoning once and for all a depressing condition similar to that of children who play in their little room, end quote. In order to undo the repression or the suppression or this displacement of our cultural memory, and I won't go into issues of Freud and hermeneutics here, we do not need to make a tabula rasa of our past. But it is not enough to just recover a lost piety in our attitude toward our past. I'm talking about artistic and literary, more than historical, of course, thought. Rather, it is necessary to reinvent our memory, recombine our cultural DNA in a creative, responsible, sustainable, and above all, non-cynical way. For instance, and now I can mention, my recent work is mostly focused on how so-called new media and the digital divide, in a sense, can provide a platform for a sustainable reinvention of literary and historical memory. It's an educational task, mostly. For the time being, at the end of this year of celebrations and near collapse, we are left with an Italy that is neither here nor there, neither poor, whole, or nor irreparably broken into pieces, and perhaps never will be, neither the historical ghost of itself nor an open construction field, but a little bit of both. As in Romano's endlessly unfinished geographic puzzle, in our attempt to make sense of Italy, past and future, private and public, virtues and vices, we are stuck in a limbo of non-space and non-time, and non-present, if you wish, in which each of us, young or old, lives on with his or her flickering memories of better or worse times, still seated on our dead grandparents' chair.
I have a difficult task after
Yes.
this poetic presentation, full of very nice images and metaphors, and I'm much more prosaic. I would like to thank the organizers again for the honor and the pleasure of actually being at a conference in which people have picked up all the many missing pieces from my book. And frankly, recently there was someone who reviewed the book and said, but this book is rather short, so there was so much to say there's so much to say about this topic, and the author has chosen to focus on a few particular moments, but why not all? So now I think that you gave me, again, the desire to write really a big book in which everything will be covered. But instead of going in that direction, because I still think that shorter books may be read by more people than longer book encyclopedic books, and actually writing this book, I hope that there would be sort of more people reading it. So I got from this conference, in fact, the ideas for many more books that someone else will write. Maybe I'm sort of sticking so far to the ones I write now. But first of all, I really thought that it's very useful, the idea of the virtuous minorities. I mean, as a way to sort of as a new cantiere of ricerca, because in fact I sort of primarily focused on sort of representations of Italianity, but that was of course in a context, in a political context, in a context of nation building. But this culture, I mean, seeing the formation of ideas of virtues attached to virtuous minorities, and sort of there is a whole space there really for a very interesting project of research, and I was thinking in particular about the way in which, if we consider the problems of the present and the problems of the left in dealing with the challenges of, let's say, late capitalism, late commercial society, and so on, we can see the unpreparedness if we think about this kind of elitism of the culture of the left, and how in the context of the passage from the first to the so-called Second Republic, with the disintegration of Marxism and a class discourse in Italy, the left has picked up, let's say the non-liberal left has picked up completely, let's say, the legacy of azionismo, that has this kind of very strong discourse about the sort of the vices, right, and the contrast with the virtuous minorities. So the left somehow has become, has had even more problems dealing with the present because of this kind of, let's say, the absorbing of this kind of culture. So analyzing the political culture in this light seems to me would be quite productive for understanding, why it was so unable also to deal with. Of course, there are other reasons. We all know the split of the PCI was, and the suicide of the PCI was one. But then, again, considering the formation of the culture of the left also before, and in this passage would be really quite interesting. So it sort of gave me the formulation of this conference in terms of virtuous minorities. I thought was great. I mean, it's very productive. The other thing that I also found very interesting, and that I think it's something that I would accept as a criticism, is that, in fact, I sort of maybe too quickly dismissed the question of the other half, meaning women, right, in the discourse on character. I mean, I sort of picked it up again, but I did not analyze it systematically, as a matter of fact, because constructions of the woman citizen, right, should be sort of integral to the project too. So the virtuous woman and the model in different political regimes. So gender and character, even though character is public man, and so it's a gender masculine construction. However, woman as the sort of the complementary citizens with the subject citizenry, B-class citizen, that should also be part of the picture. So the particular constructions of women as virtuous citizens of a particular kind. And also in connection with that, another strand, another theme that needs certainly more exploration, or at least maybe putting together researches that have been done, research that has been done on specific times, but the question of the education of the virtuous elites, but then also with the constitution of the Republican state, the question of sort of the missing education, or the education that was not done completely. I mean, an idea of educating citizens to the duties and the virility and the rights of being a part of democratic republic. I mean, how that project, maybe there was something at the beginning, how it was led. I heard a paper on that made me think about the possibility of doing much more in that respect. Another maybe really big thematic issue that sort of that comes up from some of the research done on these issues of virtues and vices should be the emotional, let's say, the emotional configuration that attaches to this discourse of virtues and vices, which is something that I sort of did not sort of develop conceptually, but seems to me quite important. Maybe the emotional configuration of republicanism too, or anyway of this kind of political culture. So of republicanism in general, and you know, and as I was listening to the paper before on the various inflections of republicanism in the first half of the 19th century, I thought that sort of looking at those made me think, I mean, understanding better this history of republicanism in Italy would be quite important for understanding the problems of this neo-republicanism, or that never really develops. I mean, the proposal for a sort of a new republicanism, patriotic republicans in Italy today. So there are sort of lots of. I thought that there were lots of ideas that really deserve to be developed, and they, I'm sure, would be very productive. And then I loved, in particular, as we were talking about the problems of translating certain ideas about democratic citizenship and Republican patriotism. I was thinking, and the limits of these kind of prospects. I was thinking that what we heard yesterday afternoon from Lorella Zanardo was terrific in terms of an actual concrete alternative. And the figure of a kind of new activist who does not position herself in the old sort of in the way that some of the proponents of this kind of new republicanism do, because she sort of understands that there are that out there are individuals who think about themselves as fully agents, and so they're not just people who can be educated, but they have to. What you do, you need to have a conversation with it. So it's a kind of an alternative model that seems to be working in practice. So I appreciated the fact that the organizers of the conference thought, maybe they thought already very well about making reflections also on a different practice, on a different series of practices, which is, I think, what we need more, instead of of reiterating the educational model that comes from above, right? That we need to educate the masses and so on. It's a dialogue that seems to be much more important, and also the reflection, the critical self-reflection on the limits of political action in that old model. So, and with the challenges of the commercial society in which we live. So I thought that there would be sort of really quite a lot of projects here sort of developing from this, and so this is quite, to me, it's quite sort of makes me feel good if I have sort of been able to offer some ideas and with my own work, and you gave me a huge numbers of ideas on many things. So I actually would rather open up the floor and stop here, because this is well, I had the privilege of talking yesterday, so maybe someone else should actually conclude.
Thank you very much.